Chapter 1. Whispers Beneath the Walls. The old hospital stood on the outskirts of town, its looming presence casting a long shadow over the barren landscape. Once a place of healing, its true history was buried beneath centuries of silence. Only the rusted iron gate and crumbling stone walls hinted at its darker past, a time when it served not as a hospital, but as a psychiatric institution for the broken, the lost, and the forgotten. Dr. Vincent Blackwood had never believed in the rumors. He was a man of science, grounded in reason and logic, but something about the hospital had always unsettled him. As he walked the empty halls, his footsteps echoed in a way that made the silence feel alive. He had been tasked with reviewing the hospital's current operations, though most of the building had been abandoned for decades. Only a small wing remained in use, housing long-term patients who had nowhere else to go. The rest of the hospital was off-limits, condemned after years of neglect. Yet Vincent found himself drawn to the older sections, the ones where the walls seemed to whisper if you stood still long enough. He had heard stories from the nurses, tales of patients seeing things that weren't there, of strange noises in the night, but Vincent dismissed them. Still, his curiosity pulled him deeper into the hospital's forgotten corridors. As he passed through a rusted metal door, the air seemed to grow colder, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The walls here were older, stained yellow from years of water damage, and the floors creaked beneath his weight. Ahead of him, a long hallway stretched into darkness, lined with rooms that had long since been sealed shut. Vincent stopped in front of one door in particular. The plaque above it was worn, the letters barely legible, but he could make out the faint inscription, Ward 13. This was the part of the hospital that had housed the most disturbed patients centuries ago. Those who had lost touch with reality, who had been subjected to experimental treatments, had all been placed here. The records were incomplete, most lost to time, but whispers of what had happened in Ward 13 persisted in local legend. His hand hovered over the door handle for a moment, hesitating, but curiosity got the better of him. The handle was cold, almost unnaturally so, and as he twisted it, the door creaked open with a groan that seemed to resonate through the entire wing. Inside, the room was barren, save for an old, rusted bed frame and a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. As Vincent stepped inside, a gust of cold air blew through the room, rattling the mirror. He froze. There, reflected in the cracked glass, was something, or someone, that shouldn't have been there. The reflection showed a woman, her face obscured by shadows, standing in the far corner of the room. Her eyes, though dim in the glass, seemed to pierce right through him, cold and unfeeling. He turned around quickly, but the room was empty. A chill crawled up his spine, but he forced himself to breathe, shaking off the moment as a trick of the light. The building was old. After all, he was tired, and the mind had a way of playing tricks on itself in such places. Still, the feeling lingered. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. He stepped toward the bed, noticing strange markings on the floor, circular patterns that had been etched into the concrete long ago. Kneeling down, he traced the lines with his fingers, feeling the grooves worn deep into the floor. They looked ritualistic, though their meaning was lost to him. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. Vincent jumped to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had locked itself, trapping him inside. The room grew colder still, and from somewhere deep within the hospital, he heard a faint sound, a whisper, too soft to understand but unmistakably human. It was coming from behind the walls, as if someone, or something, was trapped just beyond the barrier of bricks and mortar. He pounded on the door, hoping it would give way, but it held firm. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they surrounded him from all sides. He pressed his ear against the wall, listening. The whispers weren't just noise. They were words, fragmented and unclear, but real. They spoke of pain, of suffering, of something far worse than madness. Then, the scratching began. It was faint at first, a soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across stone. Vincent's pulse quickened as the scratching grew louder, closer, until it sounded as if it were right behind him. He spun around, his eyes darting across the empty room, but there was no one there. And yet, the scratching persisted, growing more frantic with each passing second. His gaze fell on the mirror again, and this time, he saw something new. The woman was gone, but in her place, words had appeared in the cracks of the glass, written in some dark substance that looked like dried blood. "Help us." Vincent backed away from the mirror, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination. But the words were there, staring back at him, as real as the walls around him. Without warning, the door flew open, the force of it slamming against the wall. Vincent stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest as he bolted from the room. He didn't look back as he sprinted down the hallway, the whispers still echoing in his ears. Whatever had happened in Ward 13 was still alive in some way, still reaching out from the past, desperate to be heard. As Vincent reached the safety of the hospital's modern wing, the whispers faded, leaving him in an unsettling silence. He leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath, but his thoughts were already racing ahead, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. The hospital was not what it seemed. Something was still here, something ancient and filled with suffering, and Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, it had been waiting for him all along. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Wing. Vincent couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had seeped into his bones. Ward 13 was no mere anomaly, no vestige of an outdated psychiatric wing. There was something far darker lurking beneath the surface of the hospital, something hidden in its very foundation. As the daylight outside began to fade, the shadows in the hospital stretched, swallowing the corridors in a slow, creeping darkness. He knew he should leave, return home to clear his mind, but something anchored him to the building. The whispers still clung to his thoughts, the scratched words in the mirror burning in his memory. "Help us." The air seemed thicker here, heavier with the weight of centuries. Vincent found himself wandering deeper into the hospital, passing the sterile, lifeless rooms of the modern wing until he reached an old and used hallway. This part of the hospital had been closed for decades, left to decay in silence. The Forgotten Wing, as the staff had called it, had once been a place of isolation for patients deemed too dangerous to mingle with others. The administrators had ordered it sealed after a fire had broken out some 30 years ago, though no one had ever determined the cause. Most of the wing had survived the fire, but the section had been abandoned ever since, left to rot behind a thick layer of dust and memories. Vincent stood before the entrance, staring at the door that separated the modern world from the remnants of a bygone era. The door was old, the wood warped with age, and the glass window set into its center was clouded with grime. Hesitating only for a moment, he pushed it open with a groan, the sound echoing unnervingly in the stillness. The hallway beyond was dim, lit only by the faint rays of dusk filtering through dirty, cracked windows. Vincent took a step forward, the air immediately colder, as if this wing had been untouched by time. Dust clung to the air, swirling in the faint light, while the smell of smoke, faint but unmistakable, lingered in the walls. He walked slowly, each step careful, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The floor beneath him was uneven, the tiles chipped and warped, and as he moved deeper into the wing, he noticed the remnants of what had once been a bustling part of the hospital. Faded medical posters still clung to the walls, their edges curled and yellowed with age. Old equipment lay abandoned, scattered haphazardly as if left in a rush. He passed an overturned wheelchair, its wheels frozen in place by rust, and a gurney draped with a tattered sheet. The silence was oppressive here, thick and suffocating. The only sound his own breathing and the soft creak of the floor beneath his feet. The hospital's forgotten patients had been left here, their lives erased from memory, their suffering buried beneath the weight of years. Vincent could almost feel their presence, the weight of their torment pressing down on him like an invisible hand. At the far end of the hall, a large door loomed. Unlike the others, it was made of metal, cold and unyielding, with no windows or markings. It stood as a barrier to whatever lay beyond, a final threshold that separated the forgotten wing from something even more secret. Vincent approached it cautiously, his heart quickening. There were no records of what lay beyond this door. No one in the hospital spoke of it. As he ran his hand over the surface of the door, he felt the cold metal vibrate beneath his fingers. For a moment, it almost seemed as if the door was humming, alive with some strange energy. His fingers brushed against a series of indentations, scratch marks, deep and jagged, as if someone had clawed at the door in desperation. He stepped back, his pulse quickening. Something had tried to get out. He found an old, rusted keyhole beneath the scratches, the kind used in the hospital's early days. Vincent reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring of master keys he'd been given for his review. It was unlikely any of them would fit, but something compelled him to try. As he sorted through the keys, the air around him seemed to thicken, as if the building itself was watching him, waiting for him to unlock something long forgotten. The third key slid easily into the lock. Vincent hesitated, his hand frozen on the key. Every instinct told him to turn around, to leave this place before whatever lay behind that door could touch him. But something deeper, something he couldn't quite name, urged him forward. Slowly, he turned the key, the lock clicking with a sound that echoed down the hallway like a death knell. The door swung open with a creak that grated on his ears. Beyond it lay darkness, thick and impenetrable. The light from the hallway barely pierced the blackness, revealing only a small portion of the room. Vincent stepped forward, the floor beneath his feet cold and damp. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he realized the room was enormous, far larger than he had expected. The walls were lined with rows of wooden shelves, each one filled with dusty medical records, old journals, and forgotten files. Papers littered the floor, scattered as if in a hurry, and in the center of the room stood a single examination table, its leather straps torn and frayed. A chill ran down his spine as he approached the table. Something was wrong with this place, something ancient and malevolent. The air felt charged, as if the very walls were alive with memories of pain and suffering. Vincent picked up one of the old journals from the floor. The cover was worn and brittle, the pages inside yellowed and stained. As he flipped through the journal, the faint smell of smoke returned, stronger now, and the edges of the pages were singed, blackened by fire. The journal belonged to a Dr. Wallace, a name Vincent vaguely recognized from the hospital's early days. Wallace had been the head of the psychiatric department during the hospital's darkest period. His experiments, though long forgotten, had been rumored to be brutal, unethical. The entries in the journal were fragmented, disjointed, as if Wallace had been descending into madness as he wrote. He spoke of patients who were beyond treatment, who had been consumed by something far worse than psychosis. He wrote of shadows that moved when no one was looking, of voices that spoke from the walls, of patients who disappeared without a trace. And then, on the final page, were the words that sent a shiver through Vincent's entire body. They are still here. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the room, shaking the shelves and scattering more papers across the floor. Vincent turned, his heart racing, but the door remained closed, trapping him inside. The room grew colder, the temperature plummeting until his breath came out in visible puffs of air. The shadows in the room began to move, shifting and twisting, as if something within them was trying to take shape. The air grew thick with the scent of burning wood and smoke, the fire that had once consumed this place still lingering in its very bones. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was barely visible, a faint silhouette in the shadows, but its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Vincent stepped back, his pulse pounding in his ears as the figure moved closer. Its shape was indistinct, but its eyes, cold and lifeless, stared straight into his. The figure raised its hand, pointing toward the journal in Vincent's grasp, and for a brief moment, Vincent understood. The hospital's forgotten past, the experiments, the patients, they had never left. Their suffering was etched into the walls, their souls trapped within the very fabric of the building, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. Vincent dropped the journal, the pages fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. He turned and ran, his footsteps pounding against the floor as he raced toward the door. The shadows followed him, their presence pressing against his back, growing heavier with each step. As he reached the door, it flew open, the force nearly knocking him to the ground. He stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind him. The silence returned, thick and oppressive, but the feeling of being watched never left. Vincent leaned against the wall, his chest heaving, trying to catch his breath. The Forgotten Wing had revealed only a small part of its secrets, but he knew, deep down, that the worst was yet to come. And the whispers, faint and barely audible, began again. Chapter 3: The Stained Past. The days that followed Vincent's encounter with the Forgotten Wing weighed heavily on him. Each morning he awoke with a sense of dread, and each night his dreams were haunted by flickering images of the shadowy figure. The scent of burning was still fresh in his mind. But what unsettled him the most was the journal. The cryptic writings of Dr. Wallace gnawed at his thoughts, the incomplete fragments of madness begging to be understood. Vincent had spent hours combing through hospital records, trying to piece together the lost history of the institution. Most of what he found was mundane, routine reports of psychiatric treatment from decades ago. However, anything concerning Dr. Wallace's tenure was conspicuously absent from official records, as if someone had erased all evidence of his time at the hospital. It was as if Wallace had been forgotten, just like the wing that bore the scars of his unspoken experiments. Still, the journal remained the key. The cryptic messages, the descriptions of patients suffering from something more than madness. It was all connected. But how? Vincent found himself back at the hospital, unable to stay away. This time, he returned under the cover of darkness. The evening air was thick, pressing down like a blanket, muffling the sounds of the city outside. The hospital loomed ahead of him, its once modern facade now casting long, sinister shadows in the dim glow of streetlights. It stood silent, but Vincent knew better. He could feel it breathing, alive in its slumber. Making his way inside, Vincent retraced his steps to the Forgotten Wing. The modern corridors faded behind him, replaced by the abandoned, crumbling walls of the old hospital. His footsteps echoed eerily as he approached the door to the wing once more. The door was ajar, as if it had been waiting for him. The air within the Forgotten Wing was still, heavy with dust and the faint scent of charred wood. The cold that had wrapped around him during his first visit returned, seeping into his skin and chilling him to the bone. This time, he carried a flashlight, its thin beam slicing through the darkness like a fragile thread. As he stepped deeper into the wing, he noticed something different. The shadows seemed thicker, more tangible, as if they had substance. They clung to the walls, moving subtly as he passed, though when he turned to look, they remained motionless. His pulse quickened, but he pressed on, determined to uncover whatever lay hidden in the bowels of the hospital. He returned to the metal door, the one that had separated him from the room filled with forgotten records and the malevolent presence that had nearly driven him to flee in terror. The key that had opened the door before now lay heavy in his pocket, a reminder of the horrors he had already glimpsed. With a trembling hand, he inserted the key once more and turned it. The lock clicked, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence, and the door creaked open, revealing the same dark room as before. This time, however, Vincent didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping over the shelves of decaying records and the scattered papers that littered the floor. The air was thick, suffocating, as if every breath drew in the weight of decades of suffering. The journal, still lying where he had dropped it, beckoned to him, but he ignored it, his attention drawn to something else, something new. At the far end of the room, behind the shelves, he noticed a door. It was smaller than the others, almost hidden in the shadows, its frame warped and stained. How had he missed it before? The The flashlight flickered slightly as he approached, the beam wavering in the oppressive gloom. The door bore no handle, no sign of use for countless years, but it wasn't locked. With a gentle push, it creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led downward. A chill swept through Vincent, colder than anything he had felt before, but curiosity overpowered fear. He descended the stairs, each step groaning under his weight, the narrow walls pressing in around him. The air grew colder still as he reached the bottom, and the darkness became complete, broken only by the weak beam of his flashlight. The room at the base of the stairs was small, more like a cell than a room, its stone walls covered in thick layers of grime. There was no furniture, no remnants of the hospital's presence. Just four walls, a damp floor, and a small alcove carved into the far wall. Vincent's flashlight flickered again, the beam faltering, and for a moment, he was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, his breath caught in his throat. In the alcove sat an old, rusted iron bed frame. On the bed, bound by ancient leather straps, was a figure, a skeleton, clothed in tattered remnants of a hospital gown, its bones yellowed with age. Vincent stepped forward cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The straps that bound the skeleton to the bed were frayed and brittle, but they had clearly been used to keep the person restrained. The sight of the bones, twisted in what seemed like eternal agony, sent a shiver down his spine. There were no records of this, no mention of a patient forgotten in the depths of the hospital, left to die in isolation. Whoever this person had been, they had been erased, just like Dr. Wallace's experiments. Vincent reached into his bag, pulling out his notebook, his hands shaking as he scribbled notes. This was a discovery far beyond what he had anticipated. But as he wrote, something in the room shifted. The air grew heavier, the cold more intense, and the walls seemed to close in around him. The flashlight flickered once more, and in the brief darkness, Vincent felt something brush against him. A chill ran down his spine as he whipped the light around. But nothing was there. The shadows on the walls, however, seemed to ripple, moving of their own accord. He turned back to the skeleton on the bed, but now something was different. The bones, once still, seemed to have shifted. The skull was now facing him, its hollow eye sockets staring directly into his own. Vincent took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Vincent's skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He slowly backed toward the staircase, his flashlight darting around the room as the shadows twisted and writhed on the walls. As he reached the stairs, his light flickered again, plunging him into complete darkness. Panic surged through him, and he scrambled to turn the flashlight back on. When the beam returned, it illuminated the alcove one final time, empty. The skeleton was gone. The leather straps lay limp on the rusted bed frame, the tattered hospital gown discarded on the floor. Vincent's heart pounded in his chest as he turned and raced up the stairs, his footsteps loud and frantic in the silence. The door at the top of the stairs slammed shut behind him as he burst through, back into the room filled with records and forgotten documents. The shadows in the room were still now, silent and unmoving, but the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the very walls of the hospital were closing in on him. Vincent stumbled out of the forgotten wing, his mind reeling. The hospital had revealed another piece of its dark history, but there was more, so much more. And now, he was certain that whatever had been unleashed, whatever had been buried beneath the weight of years, was not content to remain hidden any longer. As Vincent left the hospital, the coldness followed him, lingering in the air like a warning. Chapter 4. The Surgeon's Mark. The morning after Vincent's unnerving discovery weighed heavily on him, the cold from the hospital still lingering deep in his bones. He couldn't shake the image of the skeleton in the basement, the straps binding it, and the sense of some malevolent presence lurking in the darkness. Despite his fear, something deeper, an insatiable need for answers, compelled him to return once more to the hospital. There were too many pieces left unanswered, and if he was to uncover the full truth, he would need to confront whatever lurked in its decaying halls. Vincent spent the day gathering more research, combing through what little documentation remained of the hospital's long-forgotten history. He visited archives, museums, and even reached out to local historians, but few could offer more than vague references to the hospital's past. It was as though the more he tried to learn, the more elusive the truth became. But then, buried deep within the stacks of a dusty old library, Vincent stumbled upon something. A thin, brittle book of medical records from the late 19th century, well before the hospital had been converted into a psychiatric ward. The pages were yellowed with age, and the text was faint, written in long, elegant cursive. As he flipped through the pages, a name caught his eye. Dr. Samuel Marlowe, chief surgeon. Marlowe's name had not appeared in any of Vincent's prior research. Yet, here was an extensive record of his time at the hospital, dating back to its earlier days when it had served as a surgical facility. According to the records, Marlowe had been a well-respected figure in the medical community, known for his pioneering techniques. But the further Vincent read, the more unsettling the accounts became. Patient after patient had entered Dr. Marlowe's operating room, but many never left. A disturbingly high number of post-operative deaths were recorded, often attributed to unforeseen complications or anomalies in patient recovery. And then, in the final pages, were the reports of patients disappearing entirely, their bodies never accounted for. The last few entries in the book were hastily written, referencing some kind of incident that had led to the closure of Marlowe's wing and his sudden resignation. Vincent closed the book, his hands trembling. There was something more than just failed surgeries here. Dr. Marlowe had been hiding something dark. Could he have been connected to the skeleton Vincent had discovered? Were these missing patients the ones who had been forgotten, their fates sealed within the walls of the hospital? Unable to resist, Vincent returned to the hospital that evening. This time, he wasn't looking for Dr. Wallace or the shadows that haunted the psychiatric wing. No, tonight, he was looking for Marlowe. The hospital greeted him with the same oppressive silence, but Vincent felt more in control now, as if the discovery of Dr. Marlowe's records had granted him some understanding of the darkness that pervaded the building. The flashlight in his hand felt heavier than usual, its beam more fragile in the endless gloom. He made his way toward the old surgical wing, deeper into the hospital than he had ever ventured before. The surgical wing was located in the oldest part of the building, a section long abandoned and left to rot. As Vincent approached, the architecture changed, becoming more archaic and foreboding. Gone were the sterile white walls of the modern hospital. In their place stood dark wooden beams, cracked plaster, and rusted metal fixtures. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and a faint, lingering smell of antiseptic hung in the air, as though the remnants of old surgeries still permeated the space. Vincent's flashlight flickered as he stepped through the door into the surgical wing. The halls were narrow and winding, the floors coated with a thick layer of dust that had not been disturbed in years. Medical carts, overturned and rusted, lay scattered in the corners. Old surgical tools, scalpels, forceps, and syringes, were abandoned on countertops, their metal gleaming faintly in the dim light. It was as though the wing had been frozen in time, left to deteriorate in the wake of whatever horrors had occurred here. Vincent's heart pounded as he ventured deeper, the beam of his flashlight casting eerie shadows along the walls. He could feel it now, an almost palpable weight in the air, something that clung to the walls and floor like an unseen presence watching his every move. The farther he went, the colder it became, as though the temperature was dropping with every step. Finally, he reached a set of double doors, their glass windows long shattered, revealing the operating room beyond. The door creaked open with a slow, drawn-out groan as Vincent pushed it. The room beyond was massive, far larger than he had expected. The center of the room was dominated by an old, rusted operating table, its leather straps still intact, stained dark from years of use. Overhead, a large, cracked surgical light hung from the ceiling, its bulb long dead. But it was the walls that caught Vincent's attention. They were covered in diagrams, detailed anatomical drawings, notes scribbled in hasty handwriting, and charts of unknown symbols. Some were medical, others more esoteric, blending science with something darker. It was as though Dr. Marlowe had been documenting his experiments, attempting to unlock something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of medicine. Vincent's gaze was drawn to a large cabinet at the far end of the room. It stood open, revealing rows of jars filled with preserved organs, floating in murky liquid. He approached, the sight both horrifying and fascinating. Each jar was carefully labeled, not with the name of the organ, but with the name of a patient. Patient number 48, anomalous heart tissue. Patient number 53, brain sample, post-operation. Patient number 61, unknown growth, spine. The labels told a story of madness, of a man who had gone far beyond the ethical boundaries of medicine. Dr. Marlowe hadn't just been a surgeon. He had been something more, experimenting on his patients in ways that no one could have imagined. But to what end? What had he been trying to achieve? Vincent felt a chill run down his spine as he turned back to the operating table. The more he stood in the room, the more he could feel it. The presence of something long dead but still lingering, a malevolent force that clung to every corner of the space. He could almost hear the faint echo of surgical instruments clattering, the distant sound of something being cut, of flesh being opened. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow moved at the far end of the room, just beyond the edge of his flashlight's beam. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Vincent had seen it. Something darting between the cabinets and the shelves of surgical tools. His heart raced, but he couldn't bring himself to move. His hands tightened around the flashlight as he slowly turned, sweeping the beam across the room. The shadow was gone, but the air had changed. The temperature had plummeted, and the sound of something faint, almost like breathing, filled the room. Vincent's pulse thundered in his ears as he stood frozen, listening, waiting. Suddenly, the surgical light above him flickered. A brief, weak glow emitted from the bulb before it faded back into darkness. In that moment of light, Vincent saw the operating table clearly, and lying on it was a figure, strapped down by the leather bindings, its body still and silent. Vincent stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering to the ground as he turned to flee. He bolted from the room, the cold air biting at his skin as he raced through the halls of the surgical wing, the shadows chasing him from every corner. When he finally reached the exit, he collapsed against the door, gasping for breath. The hospital stood silent around him, but Vincent knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. Dr. Marlowe's secrets were buried deep within the walls, and whatever horrors the surgeon had unleashed were far from over. As Vincent staggered out into the cold night, the weight of the hospital's past hung heavy on him. He knew he was only beginning to scratch the surface of the darkness that lay beneath. Chapter 5. The Cold Ward. The following day, Vincent could barely shake off the remnants of the night before. Sleep had eluded him entirely, leaving him with hollow eyes and a mind that was a jumble of fractured images. The shadow in the surgical wing, the figure strapped to the operating table, and the faint sensation that something terrible was waking within the hospital. The thought gnawed at him constantly. Despite the terror that had gripped him the previous night, the draw of uncovering the truth remained too powerful to resist. Vincent knew there were more parts of the hospital that he hadn't yet explored. His encounter with the operating room had revealed one part of Dr. Marlowe's dark legacy, but there were other wings, forgotten wards, and places locked away for good reason. Today, his aim was to investigate one of those places, an isolated section known simply as the Cold Ward. He had come across it in his research, hidden within the hospital's architectural blueprints. The ward had been closed for nearly a century, cut off from the rest of the hospital by crumbling walls and barricaded doors. According to old reports, it had once been used to house patients who had been deemed too dangerous for conventional treatment. They were people who had suffered from extreme psychotic breaks, violent tendencies, and nightmarish hallucinations. It was there that the hospital had performed the most brutal and unethical procedures in an attempt to cure the incurable. With the sun still hanging low in the sky, Vincent prepared himself to return to the hospital once more. The light was barely filtering through the gray clouds as he pulled up to the decaying building. The cold air seemed sharper than usual, biting at his skin as he approached the main entrance. The hospital loomed ahead of him, its towering structure seeming to stretch farther into the sky with each visit. Shadows played across the cracked windows, and the faint sound of the wind rattled through the broken shutters. As he stepped inside, The familiar silence enveloped him. Vincent's flashlight flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the walls. He had learned the layout of the hospital well by now, and made his way toward the blocked-off section where the cold ward lay in wait. The closer he got, the more the temperature seemed to drop, the air around him growing colder and thinner, as if the very building resisted his approach. Finally, Vincent reached a door that looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. The wood was splintered, the paint peeling, and rust had consumed the metal handle. The door was barricaded with old, rotting boards, nailed into place by someone intent on keeping whatever lay beyond sealed away. He hesitated for a moment, knowing that crossing this threshold meant venturing deeper into the hospital's darkest history. He pulled a crowbar from his bag and, after several strained efforts, managed to pry the boards free. With a final, sharp crack, the last nail popped loose, and the door creaked open. A blast of cold air hit him like a wave, as if the room had been waiting all this time for someone to breach its isolation. The hallway beyond the door was narrow and claustrophobic, the air thick with a freezing mist that seemed to cling to the walls. Vincent's flashlight struggled against the darkness, its beam barely cutting through the oppressive gloom. Old medical equipment lay abandoned along the sides of the hall, gurneys with rusted wheels, broken force-stands, and medical trays strewn across the floor as though whoever had last been here had left in a hurry. The cold ward was aptly named. Even through his heavy coat, Vincent could feel the temperature continuing to drop the farther he went. His breath came out in visible puffs of air, and the frost had begun to creep up the walls, as though nature itself was trying to reclaim this forgotten place. Ahead, the hallway ended in another door, this one larger and reinforced with metal bars. A series of numbers were etched into the wood, designating it as Ward C, the most restricted area of the hospital. This was where the worst of the patients had been kept, those whom doctors had deemed beyond help, their madness too dangerous to control. Vincent hesitated, his hand hovering over the door's handle. He could feel the weight of the hospital bearing down on him, pressing against his chest. There was something waiting behind that door, something old and cruel, forgotten by time but never truly gone. Summoning all his courage, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, much larger than the cramped hallway suggested. It had once been an expansive ward, filled with rows of iron beds, each one bolted to the floor with thick restraints. Now, the beds were empty, their sheets rotted and torn, the metal rusted and discolored. The walls were lined with frosted-over windows, though no light penetrated through them. The air was unnaturally cold, colder than anywhere else Vincent had been in the hospital. In the center of the room stood something unexpected, a large, cylindrical object, roughly the size of a person. At first glance, it looked like an iron lung, the kind used to assist patients with respiratory problems. But upon closer inspection, Vincent realized it was something far more sinister. The machine was lined with wires and clamps, each one connected to parts of the body that shouldn't be touched by such things. Surgical tools were scattered around the base, many still sharp and clean, as though they had been in use not too long ago. There was something else, a figure, lying motionless inside the machine. Vincent's flashlight beam fell upon the figure, revealing a body strapped inside the cold metal casing. The body was preserved unnaturally well, as though the freezing temperatures had halted the decay. Its eyes were closed, its skin pale and smooth, and its hands were curled into fists, bound tightly by thick leather straps. The figure's chest was covered by a strange device, something like a harness, but it was fused with wires and clamps, and tubes ran from it into the body's veins. As Vincent examined the scene closer, he noticed the scars. Deep, long scars that ran across the body's arms and chest, as though it had been repeatedly cut open and sewn back together. The machine wasn't just for keeping patients alive. It had been used for experimentation, for something much darker than he had imagined. He stepped back, a wave of nausea hitting him. The room, the cold, the figure. It all felt wrong, as though he had stumbled into a place where life and death no longer held meaning. The cold ward had been a prison, not just for the bodies of the patients, but for their very souls, trapped in some kind of limbo between existence and oblivion. As Vincent turned to leave, something shifted in the air. The cold deepened, and the faint sound of breathing filled the room, soft at first but growing louder with every passing second. His heart raced as he swung his flashlight around, trying to locate the source of the sound. But the room was empty. The figure in the machine remained still, and yet the sound of breathing grew louder, now accompanied by a faint rattling, as though metal restraints were being strained. The temperature plummeted further, and frost began to form on the edges of Vincent's vision. The breath he had been hearing, it wasn't just air escaping old machines. It was something else, something living. With growing urgency, Vincent backed away from the machine. The cold had become unbearable, seeping through his skin and into his bones. As he reached the door, he cast one last glance at the room. The figure in the machine was no longer motionless. It twitched, ever so slightly, its head tilting just enough for Vincent to see that its eyes had opened. They were wide, frozen in a state of perpetual terror, and they were looking straight at him. Vincent stumbled back, his hands fumbling with the door as he pulled it shut behind him. He raced back down the hallway, his breath coming in rapid, shallow bursts as the cold seemed to chase him through the winding corridors. The cold ward, with its frozen horrors and trapped souls, would not release him so easily. As he emerged from the hospital once again, the warmth of the outside world did nothing to ease the chill that had settled deep within him. Vincent knew that he had uncovered something far worse than anything he had ever expected. The cold ward was more than just a place for forgotten patients. It was a place where life itself had been corrupted, twisted into something monstrous. And whatever it wasn't done with him yet. Chapter 6: Whispers in the Walls. The day after his encounter in the cold ward, Vincent found himself unable to focus. The weight of what he had witnessed lingered with him, haunting his every thought. The figure in the iron machine, the frost-clad room, the breath of something long dead but still alive. It was as though the hospital had sunk its claws into his mind, dragging him deeper into its malevolent past. He tried to shake it off, but sleep brought no relief. His dreams were filled with the sound of breathing, the sight of scars, and cold hands reaching out to pull him back into that frozen nightmare. Even in waking hours, Vincent couldn't escape the sense that the hospital was calling to him, demanding that he return. The air outside felt too warm, too bright, as if reality had lost its grip on him. The hospital was his only tether to something real, even if it was a tether made of horror. Vincent knew he couldn't avoid the inevitable. If he was ever to understand what was happening within those decaying walls, he would need to go back. He couldn't leave it unfinished. The cold ward had been one mystery, but there was so much more left unexplored. Armed with new resolve and the weight of a heavy, sleepless night, Vincent returned to the hospital just as the gray sky was beginning to cloud over. A storm was coming. He could feel it in the sharp wind and the thickening air, pregnant with the promise of rain. The hospital stood like a sentinel on the edge of town, its towering structure outlined against the backdrop of gathering clouds. Today, he would venture into the deeper sections of the hospital. The cold ward had been unsettling, but there were other places he hadn't yet explored. Rooms that had been locked away, not by boards or chains, but by the hospital's very architecture. There were passages in the blueprints that led to nowhere, staircases that wound into dead ends, and walls that seemed to hold within them the echoes of long-forgotten voices. Vincent entered the hospital through the same main door, now so familiar to him that it no longer held the sense of dread it once did. He flicked on his flashlight, and the beam cut through the gloom as he navigated his way through the familiar halls. The smell of mold and decay was omnipresent, and the hospital's silence was once again broken only by the sound of his own footsteps. He was searching for a specific section today, an area noted in the hospital's old records, but curiously absent from the blueprints. According to the documents he had found in the archives, this wing was once used to house the most volatile of patients, those who had been driven mad not by illness, but by their own experiences within the hospital walls. There were stories, rumors, that the very building itself had driven them to madness, that the hospital was alive in a way no one could explain. As Vincent walked deeper into the labyrinthine corridors, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew heavier, colder, not with the sharp, biting chill of the cold ward, but a damp, suffocating humidity that clung to his skin. The smell of mildew was overwhelming, and the walls seemed to ooze moisture, as if the building itself was sweating. The hallways narrowed, the ceiling lowering as he descended deeper into the bowels of the hospital. The paint was peeling from the walls in long strips, revealing the ancient plaster beneath. The floors were uneven, cracked tiles jutting up in random places as if the ground itself was rebelling against the structure above it. At last, Vincent came upon a narrow door, half hidden behind a pile of collapsed ceiling tiles and broken furniture. The wood was swollen and warped with age, the handle rusted and bent. This was it, the hidden section. He pulled the door open with a creak that reverberated down the hallway. Beyond it lay a set of steep, narrow stairs that descended into the darkness. His flashlight beam revealed only more shadows at the bottom, the walls closing in on either side as if the space had been deliberately designed to feel suffocating. It felt like stepping into a tomb. Vincent hesitated for only a moment before descending the stairs, the weight of each step adding to the sense of claustrophobia. The walls were wet, slick with condensation, and the air was thick, making it hard to breathe. The stairs went on longer than they should have, winding deeper into the earth, each step feeling more distant from the hospital above. Finally, he reached the bottom. The air was colder here, though not as bone-chilling as the cold ward. Instead, there was a stagnant quality to it, as though the air hadn't been disturbed in decades. He was now standing in a narrow, low-ceilinged hallway. The walls here were different, older, made of stone rather than plaster, as though this part of the hospital had been constructed long before the rest. The hallway stretched out ahead of him, disappearing into the darkness. Vincent's flashlight flickered momentarily, casting strange shadows along the uneven stone walls. He pressed forward, his footsteps echoing faintly in the oppressive silence. As he moved farther into the corridor, he began to notice something strange. The walls here were etched with markings, not like graffiti, but something more deliberate. Symbols and patterns had been carved into the stone, winding along the length of the hall like some ancient script. Some were faded and worn, barely visible, while others seemed fresh, as if they had been etched into the stone only recently. Vincent ran his hand over one of the symbols. The stone was cold to the touch, but the markings felt deeper than they should have, almost as if they had been pressed into the stone by something inhumanly strong. The symbols themselves were unfamiliar, a strange mix of geometric shapes and jagged lines, none of which he could recognize from any language or writing system he knew. As he moved deeper into the hall, the air grew colder, and the strange symbols became more frequent. They covered the walls entirely now, crisscrossing in chaotic patterns that seemed to pulse with an energy all their own. Vincent felt a growing sense of unease, as if the walls were closing in on him, watching him. The symbols seemed to shimmer in the light of his flashlight, casting strange reflections that twisted and distorted the shadows around him. At the far end of the corridor, Vincent saw something else, a door, heavy and reinforced with iron bars. The door was slightly ajar, its hinges creaking faintly in the still air. Beyond it, the corridor opened into a larger room, though the details were lost in the shadows. Vincent approached cautiously, pushing the door open with a low groan of metal on stone. The room beyond was vast, far larger than any space he had seen in the hospital so far. The ceiling stretched high above him, disappearing into the darkness, and the walls were lined with rows upon rows of old metal shelves, each one filled with papers, books, and ancient medical instruments. This was a storage room, long forgotten, untouched by time. He stepped into the room, the beam of his flashlight casting long shadows across the dusty floor. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and rusting metal, and the only sound was the faint drip of water echoing somewhere in the distance. Vincent approached one of the shelves, his eyes scanning the papers that lay strewn across the surface. Many of the documents were too damaged to read, their edges crumbling into dust as he touched them. But others were still legible, their faded ink telling stories of the hospital's past. He found medical records, handwritten notes detailing the conditions of the patients who had been housed here. Many of the names were unfamiliar, but a few stood out, names he had seen in the archives before. These were the patients who had been part of the hospital's darkest experiments, subjected to treatments so brutal and inhumane that their minds had been shattered beyond repair. As Vincent sifted through the papers, he began to notice a pattern. Many of the patients had been confined to this hidden section of the hospital, away from the others, their conditions worsening rapidly after being brought here. The records spoke of strange symptoms, uncontrollable fits of rage, hallucinations of shadowy figures, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. It was as if something within these walls had driven them to madness, something far older than the hospital itself. Then, at the bottom of one of the stacks, Vincent found something that made his blood run cold: a map. It was old, the paper yellowed with age, but the layout was unmistakable. It was a map of the hospital, but not the hospital as he knew it. This map showed an entirely different structure, one that extended far beneath the foundations of the building above. And at the very center of the map, marked in thick, black ink, was a single word: the chamber. Vincent stared at the map, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what the chamber was, but he had a terrible feeling that it was something ancient, something that had been buried deep within the earth for centuries. The walls of the hospital were not just walls. They were barriers, holding something back, keeping it hidden. He folded the map carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. Whatever was happening in the hospital, whatever had driven the patients mad, it was connected to the chamber. And Vincent knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that he would have to find it. As he left the room, the air around him seemed to pulse with energy, the strange symbols on the walls glowing faintly in the darkness. Something had been awakened, something that had been sleeping for centuries, and now it was waiting for him. Chapter 7. The Descent. The storm had begun to unleash its fury by the time Vincent left the storage room, its thunderous roar echoing through the hospital's crumbling corridors. The rain lashed against the windows, streaming down in sheets that blurred the outside world, trapping him even further in the oppressive gloom of the hospital. Lightning flashed intermittently, casting brief, stark light through the narrow windows, but within the hospital, the shadows reigned. The map Vincent had found in the forgotten room weighed heavily in his mind as he moved deeper into the hospital's bowels. He could feel the dampness of the air thickening, the musty smell of decay intensifying. The hospital seemed to react to him now, as if aware of his presence. Every creak, every distant sound of metal groaning or wood settling felt alive, like a warning whisper in the dark. He pressed forward nonetheless, determined to unravel the mystery of the chamber. The map had led him to a section of the hospital he hadn't yet explored, a series of underground tunnels beneath the main building. They were not marked on any official blueprints, likely abandoned long before the hospital had ceased its operations. These tunnels, according to the documents, were constructed as part of the original psychiatric wing, where some of the most disturbing experiments had been conducted. Vincent found the entrance to the tunnels hidden beneath an old stairwell in the eastern wing. A rusted iron grate covered the opening, bolted shut long ago. But time had taken its toll on the metal, and with some effort, Vincent pried it free. The grate fell away with a screech, the sound piercing the otherwise thick silence of the hospital. Beneath it, a narrow stone staircase spiraled downward into the darkness. He hesitated for a moment at the top of the stairs, peering into the void below. The air that rose from the depths smelled rank, like stagnant water and rotting wood. It felt as though the hospital itself had forgotten this place existed, as if it had been sealed away to rot beneath the earth. Yet, despite the oppressive feeling in the pit of his stomach, Vincent began his descent. The steps were uneven and slick with moisture, and Vincent had to brace himself against the damp walls to keep his footing. His flashlight illuminated the stone walls, revealing old iron rings embedded in the stone, remnants of long-forgotten infrastructure. The deeper he went, the more the modern hospital above seemed like a distant memory. Down here, it felt as if he had stepped back in time to an older, more sinister place. The air grew colder as Vincent descended. Each step echoed hollowly, as if the tunnel beneath him extended infinitely into the earth. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the hospital seemed to press down on him with each passing moment. At the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel opened into a wide stone passageway. The floor was slick with water, and the walls were covered in patches of mold that clung to the ancient stone like rot. The smell was worse down here, an overwhelming stench of decay mixed with something more pungent, like old iron. Vincent's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows along the walls, but he pressed forward. The passage stretched ahead of him, disappearing into the darkness. His footsteps splashed through shallow puddles as he walked, the sound of water dripping from the ceiling adding to the cacophony of eerie noises surrounding him. As he moved deeper into the tunnel, Vincent noticed something strange about the walls. The stone here was different, darker, smoother, almost as if it had been cut from the earth itself. The tunnel seemed unnatural, as though it had been carved by something other than human hands. Strange markings, similar to those he had seen above, began to appear again, etched into the stone. These markings were more intricate, more detailed, and seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The symbols spiraled and twisted along the walls, their patterns becoming more complex the farther he walked. It was as though the very tunnel itself had been built around them, with the symbols guiding the construction. The deeper Vincent ventured, the more these carvings began to resemble something ancient, something primal. After what felt like an eternity, Vincent reached the end of the passage. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, the ceiling soaring high above him, lost in shadow. The walls of the chamber were lined with strange stone formations, jagged and uneven, giving the room a cavernous, almost otherworldly appearance. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the uneven floor, and the sound of dripping water echoed ominously throughout the chamber. In the center of the room stood a massive stone slab, raised on a platform of dark, polished stone. It was unlike anything Vincent had ever seen before. The slab was covered in more of the strange symbols, but these were different, larger, more prominent, and glowing faintly with a pale, eerie light. The air around the slab felt charged, humming with an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Vincent approached the slab cautiously, his heart racing in his chest. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, as though something was watching, waiting. The closer he got, the more he could sense it, a presence, something ancient and malevolent that lurked just beyond the edge of his perception. As he stood before the stone slab, Vincent noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The surface of the slab was smooth, polished to a near-mirror finish, but it was covered in deep grooves, almost as if something had been bound to it. The grooves formed a strange, spiraling pattern, one that seemed to twist and warp the longer he looked at it. His mind raced with questions. What was this place? Who, or what, had built it? And more importantly, what had they done here? Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the chamber, like the sound of stone splitting. Vincent froze, his flashlight beam darting around the room, searching for the source of the noise. The sound came again, louder this time, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble. A fissure began to form in the floor, snaking its way from the base of the stone slab toward the walls of the chamber. The stone beneath him groaned and shifted as though the very earth itself was trying to tear open. Vincent took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure of what was happening. The light from his flashlight flickered wildly as the fissure widened, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something moving in the darkness below. Something large, slithering through the cracks in the stone. The air grew colder, and the sense of dread that had been lingering at the edges of his consciousness now consumed him entirely. He needed to leave. Without another thought, Vincent turned and bolted back toward the passage. His footsteps echoed wildly in the chamber as the sound of cracking stone grew louder behind him. The ground shifted beneath his feet, but he kept running, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically as he raced toward the narrow tunnel that had led him here. As he reached the entrance to the passageway, the ground gave one final, violent lurch, and the chamber behind him collapsed with a deafening roar. Dust and debris filled the air, choking his lungs and blinding him momentarily, but Vincent kept moving. He ran through the passage, up the stairs, and back into the hospital above, the sound of the collapsing chamber echoing behind him. By the time he reached the hospital's main floor, Vincent was gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He collapsed against a wall, struggling to catch his breath as his mind raced to process what he had just witnessed. He had found the chamber, but whatever lay within it was far beyond anything he had imagined. Chapter 8. Whispers in the Walls. The hospital was darker now, as if the storm raging outside had seeped through its very walls, filling it with a deep and oppressive gloom. Vincent stood in one of the empty hallways, breathing heavily, still shaken by the events that had transpired in the underground chamber. His mind raced, but no answers surfaced, only more questions, more confusion. The distant echoes of collapsing stone were fading, leaving behind an unsettling silence. Above him, the lights flickered weakly. The hospital, in its decaying state, seemed to mirror the turmoil inside Vincent's mind. What had he awakened beneath the hospital? What had stirred beneath the earth? The air felt denser now, charged with the presence of something unseen but undeniably real. He could feel it everywhere, permeating every inch of the hospital, watching him. He couldn't stop moving, though his body begged for rest. There was no rest to be found here. The walls seemed to whisper in a language he couldn't understand. Every step echoed loudly in the empty corridors, each footfall disturbing the unnatural silence that clung to the hospital like a shroud. Vincent moved cautiously through the halls, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick shadows. The once pristine tiles of the hospital floor were now cracked and grimy, and the walls, once whitewashed and sterile, were stained with the passage of time, patches of mold creeping up like dark veins. The once bustling hospital had become a mausoleum, an abandoned shell that bore the weight of its history, a history now stirring to life. The storm outside intensified, the sound of rain hammering against the windows blending with the occasional rumble of thunder. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the halls with harsh, white light, casting shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally before being swallowed by the darkness once more. In those fleeting moments, Vincent thought he saw movement, just beyond the edge of his vision, always at the corner of his eye. But when he turned, there was nothing. Only the endless stretch of desolate hospital corridors. He found himself drawn toward the east wing again, the oldest part of the hospital. This wing had been closed off decades ago, long before the hospital had shut its doors entirely. The reason for its closure was unknown, or perhaps deliberately forgotten, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic neglect and whispered rumors. Yet, Vincent felt a pull toward it, as if the answers he sought lay hidden within its decaying walls. The door to the east wing was heavy and rusted, its surface pockmarked with age. Vincent reached for the handle, feeling the cold metal bite into his palm as he twisted it. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a long, narrow corridor shrouded in darkness. The air that escaped from within was stale and thick, carrying with it a faint metallic smell, like old blood, long since dried. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The east wing felt different from the rest of the hospital, colder, older. The architecture was different too, more Gothic in style, as though it had been built in a different era. The walls were lined with narrow, arched windows, their panes long since broken or covered in grime, and the floor beneath him creaked underfoot, the wood rotting in places. The deeper he moved into the wing, the more palpable the sense of unease became. The faint whispers that had haunted him earlier grew louder here, as though the very walls were speaking to him, beckoning him deeper into the shadows. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the floor was littered with debris, fallen plaster, splintered wood, and fragments of old, rusted equipment. Vincent's flashlight flickered again, its beam wavering as he walked. He cursed silently, shaking it to keep the light steady. His heart pounded in his chest, every nerve on edge as he navigated the labyrinthine halls of the East Wing. The place seemed designed to disorient, with its narrow, twisting passageways and sudden, sharp turns. More than once, he had to stop and check his bearings, the overwhelming sense that he was being led somewhere growing stronger with each step. The hallways began to narrow as Vincent ventured farther in, the walls pressing in on him like the ribs of a decaying beast. The whispers, once faint and indistinct, now felt closer, like they were coming from the very stones around him. He paused, shining his light across the peeling wallpaper and cracked plaster, and saw something that stopped him cold. Along the walls, just visible beneath layers of grime and decay, were more of the strange symbols he had seen in the underground chamber. These were older, more worn, but the patterns were unmistakable, spiraling, intertwining shapes that seemed to pulse with a dark energy, even in their faded state. They covered the walls, stretching down the length of the corridor, growing more frequent and more elaborate the farther he walked. Vincent's breath caught in his throat as he reached the end of the corridor, where a large, heavy door stood waiting. Unlike the others, this door was intact, its surface smooth and unblemished, as though time had not touched it. The symbols were carved deeply into the wood, more pronounced here, glowing faintly in the dim light. He hesitated, staring at the door for a long moment. Something about it felt wrong, like it was a boundary between the hospital and something far older, something not meant to be disturbed. But Vincent had come too far to turn back now. He reached for the handle and, with a deep breath, pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, far larger than it had any right to be, given the size of the hospital. The ceiling stretched high above him, lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with tall, narrow windows through which the storm outside raged, casting fleeting flashes of light across the room. The air was cold, colder than it had been anywhere else in the hospital, and it smelled of old stone and something else, something more primal. In the center of the room was a single stone altar, raised on a dais and surrounded by a circle of intricate symbols carved into the floor. The altar was similar to the one he had seen in the underground chamber, but this one was larger, more elaborate, its surface covered in deep grooves and channels that twisted and spiraled across its surface. The air around the altar felt charged, vibrating with a low hum that set his teeth on edge. Vincent stepped forward, his flashlight flickering wildly now, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. As he approached the altar, he noticed something strange. The symbols on the floor seemed to shift and move beneath his feet, as though they were alive, writhing like serpents. The closer he got to the altar, the more intense the sensation became, until it felt like the very ground was pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. He stopped just before the altar, staring down at its surface. The grooves were deep, almost like they had been worn into the stone by something, or someone, over countless years. At the center of the altar was a single, smooth depression, perfectly round and polished to a mirror-like sheen. The air around it was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt, and it seemed to draw him in, pulling at him with an invisible force. Vincent reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the surface of the altar. The moment his fingers brushed the stone, the air around him seemed to shudder, and a deep, resonant sound filled the room. It wasn't a sound he could hear with his ears, but one he felt deep in his bones, vibrating through his very core. Suddenly, the floor beneath him began to tremble, the symbols glowing brighter as the ground seemed to shift and move. The walls around him groaned, the sound of stone grinding against stone filling the room. Vincent stumbled back, his heart racing as the altar before him began to glow with a pale, eerie light. He had to get out. Without looking back, Vincent turned and fled the room, the sound of grinding stone and whispering voices echoing behind him as the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. Chapter 9. The Pulse Beneath the Floor. The hospital loomed over Vincent as if it were an ancient monolith, a creature waiting for the right moment to awaken and reveal its secrets. The encounter in the strange room had left him shaken, but he couldn't stop now. Every step had become heavier, every breath more labored, as though the hospital was draining his energy, feeding off his fear. Yet something deeper urged him forward, a compulsion he couldn't explain. As Vincent made his way through the dimly lit corridor, the storm outside seemed to rage with renewed vigor, thunder rumbling so loudly that it reverberated through the very walls of the building. The rain lashed against the broken windows, creating a cacophony of sound that drowned out everything else. The hospital groaned, as though it were shifting beneath the weight of the tempest. The flashlight in his hand flickered, casting erratic beams of light that danced across the cracked tiles and peeling walls. The flickering light seemed to bring the symbols on the walls to life, their shapes contorting and twisting in the shadows, moving with a sinister grace that sent chills down Vincent's spine. His feet dragged across the debris-littered floor as he continued his exploration, though he had no destination in mind. The hospital had taken on a life of its own. The walls felt closer now, narrowing in a way that wasn't architectural. The hallways had begun to twist and bend in ways that defied logic, shifting imperceptibly when he wasn't looking, trapping him in a maze that grew more complex with every step. He could feel the building's pulse beneath his feet, a slow, rhythmic thrum like the beat of an ancient heart deep within the earth. The east wing stretched before him like the throat of some great beast, waiting to swallow him whole. He had crossed into this part of the hospital before, but it seemed to have transformed, becoming more foreboding with each passing moment. The air here was thick, oppressive, carrying with it a strange scent, something sharp and metallic, like blood long since dried. The floor beneath his feet creaked with every step, the wood rotten and soft, as though it could collapse at any moment. As he moved farther down the corridor, he noticed something new. Dried patches of dark brown stains splattered across the floor and walls. They were old, almost faded with time, but unmistakable. The walls whispered around him, the murmurs growing louder as he neared a large, double door at the far end of the hallway. The door was weathered, its paint chipped and peeling, revealing the dark wood underneath. The handle was tarnished brass, dull from years of disuse, yet it called to him. Vincent reached for it, the cold metal sending a shiver through his fingertips. His pulse quickened. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest as it swung wide to reveal a cavernous room beyond. Inside, the walls of the room were lined with tall iron shelves, each one filled with rows upon rows of glass jars. Hundreds of them. No, thousands. Each jar was filled with something murky, suspended in a thick, amber-colored liquid. Vincent hesitated at the threshold, his eyes scanning the rows of jars. The liquid obscured the contents, but he could make out vague shapes, small, twisted forms, preserved in the viscous fluid. The air here was colder, and the smell hit him instantly. It was a mix of decay and chemicals, an overwhelming stench that made his stomach turn. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. His flashlight flickered again, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls and floor. The jars seemed to glisten in the pale light, their contents shifting subtly as he moved deeper into the room. It was as though the things inside were still alive, still watching him from their glass prisons. At the far end of the room, Vincent noticed a large desk, its surface cluttered with old papers and medical tools, some of which were caked with dried, rust-colored stains. There was a strange sense of order amidst the chaos, as if whoever had worked here had left in a hurry, abandoning their duties but leaving everything in its place. He approached the desk, his eyes drawn to a series of photographs scattered across its surface. The images were old, yellowed with age, but they depicted scenes that sent a cold wave of dread through him. They showed the hospital in its earlier years, when it still functioned as a psychiatric facility. Patients were pictured strapped to beds, their faces gaunt and hollow, eyes wide with fear or madness. The doctors and nurses surrounding them looked clinical, detached, as though they were studying specimens rather than people. Vincent sifted through the photographs, feeling a growing sense of unease. There was something wrong here, something deeply disturbing about the way these people had been treated. The photos seemed to tell a story of torment, of experiments that had gone far beyond the bounds of medical ethics. His hands shook as he flipped through them, his breath shallow as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. One photo in particular caught his eye. It was of a woman, her face obscured by the shadows of the dimly lit room. She was strapped to a chair, her head tilted back, mouth open in a silent scream. Around her neck was a metal collar attached to wires that snaked off into the darkness. Behind her, barely visible in the gloom, stood a figure, tall, imposing, and obscured by a dark coat. Vincent's heart raced as he studied the photo. The figure looked familiar, but he couldn't place it. Something about the way they stood, the way they held themselves, it was unnerving. He turned the photograph over, hoping to find some clue, but the back was blank, save for a small, handwritten note in faded ink. Subject 17. The number echoed in his mind. Subject 17. What had they done to her? And why? He scanned the room again, his eyes lingering on the rows of jars. Could she be in one of them? Could these jars hold the remnants of whatever experiments had been conducted here? Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor beneath his feet. The jars rattled on their shelves, the liquid inside them sloshing gently, and the strange forms within seemed to twitch as though stirred by the vibrations. Vincent backed away from the desk, his heart pounding in his chest. The hum grew louder, more intense, resonating through his bones until it felt like the hospital itself was alive, like it was reacting to his presence. Without warning, one of the jars exploded, shards of glass flying across the room. Vincent ducked instinctively, covering his face as the liquid splattered against the walls. When he looked up, the thing inside the jar was moving. Slowly, deliberately, its twisted form writhing on the floor. Another jar shattered, then another, and another. One by one, the jars burst open, spilling their contents across the floor. The things inside, disfigured, grotesque remnants of human forms, began to writhe and squirm, dragging themselves toward Vincent with slow, jerky movements. Panic surged through him. He turned and ran, the sound of breaking glass and slithering bodies chasing him down the corridor. The walls seemed to close in on him as he sprinted, his footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. His lungs burned, his heart raced, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The hospital pulsed beneath him, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling his mind with their unintelligible words, their dark promises. As he rounded a corner, Vincent saw the exit up ahead, the door to the outside world, barely visible through the haze of rain and storm. He ran for it, his legs burning with exhaustion. Just a few more steps, just a little farther. But as he reached for the door, it slammed shut with a deafening thud, the sound echoing through the hallway like the toll of a bell. He stood frozen, his hand hovering in the air, inches from the handle. As the darkness behind him crept closer, the shadows deepening, thickening. The hospital had him now, and it wasn't letting go. Chapter 10. The Eyes in the Darkness. The door had sealed shut with a finality that echoed in Vincent's mind. His escape had been thwarted, the way out barred by an unseen force, leaving him trapped in the bowels of the hospital with no clear direction. The pounding of his heart was deafening, a constant reminder of his precarious situation. He turned away from the door, the dim light of his flashlight casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. The corridor stretched out before him, its length swallowed by darkness. The sense of urgency that had driven him to flee from the laboratory now transformed into a desperate quest for a new route, a new way out. The hospital had become a labyrinthine prison, shifting and contorting around him, each turn leading only to more confusion. Vincent's flashlight illuminated the path ahead, revealing walls that seemed to close in on him with every step. The decay was more pronounced here. The once white tiles were now covered in layers of grime, the wallpaper peeling away in tattered strips. The air was colder, the oppressive chill seeping into his bones, making every breath a struggle. The darkness was deep and unyielding, the faint echoes of the storm outside providing the only sound. He continued moving through the endless corridors, guided only by the shifting beam of his flashlight. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a rhythmic vibration that mirrored the pounding in his chest. Vincent tried to ignore it, focusing instead on finding a way out. Each corner he turned revealed more of the same. Endless hallways, broken fixtures, and the ever-present feeling of being watched. In one of the rooms he passed, he noticed something peculiar. The door was ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. He hesitated, then pushed the door open. Inside, the room was an odd juxtaposition of old and new. An ancient examination room with dusty and used equipment, and a modern touch with flickering screens mounted on the walls, their displays blank and dormant. Vincent stepped inside, the floor creaking under his weight. The room was cluttered with medical tools and old files, but it was the screens that drew his attention. They were turned off, their glass surfaces reflecting the dim light from his flashlight. He reached out to touch one, but the moment his fingers brushed the screen, it flickered to life, showing static before shifting to a live feed of the hallway he had just walked through. He stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The hallway was empty, but there was something unsettling about the feed. It was as if the camera had captured more than just the physical space. It showed shadows moving, shapes twisting and writhing in the darkness. He moved closer to the screen, trying to make sense of what he saw, but the feed changed abruptly to another hallway, another part of the hospital. Vincent backed away from the screen, his mind racing. The hospital had cameras everywhere, and they were still functioning despite the building's dilapidated state. He glanced around the room, noticing that the screens were part of a larger control panel, its buttons and switches coated in layers of dust. The screens continued to flicker, showing different angles of the hospital. Some of them displayed empty rooms, others showed corridors, and one even captured the storm raging outside. It was disorienting, and Vincent felt a creeping sense of dread as he realized that he was being watched, not just by the hospital, but by something else entirely. The hum of the monitors filled the room, an eerie reminder of the unseen presence that seemed to lurk within the hospital's walls. Vincent's flashlight dimmed, the beam wavering as the batteries began to fail. He fumbled in his bag for spare batteries, his hands shaking as he tried to replace them. The darkness around him seemed to grow more oppressive, the shadows lengthening and twisting as if alive. With a renewed beam of light, he returned his attention to the control panel. The screens had shifted again, now showing a feed from the very room he was in, though the camera angle was different. The image was unsettling. The room was empty, but the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. Vincent's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the movement, but there was nothing visible. The screens suddenly went black, plunging the room into darkness. Vincent's flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in a cold, suffocating blackness. He fumbled with the flashlight, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The absence of light seemed to amplify the whispers that had been haunting him, the soft, insidious voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a haunting cacophony. Vincent could feel them pressing in on him, their presence tangible, almost physical. The darkness seemed to pulse with an unearthly rhythm, each beat resonating through the floor and walls. He reached out, feeling his way along the wall, his fingers brushing against the cold, damp surface. The whispers grew louder still, coalescing into a single, overpowering sensation. A feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following his every movement. He could sense them all around him, their gaze unyielding and oppressive. In the pitch-black room, Vincent stumbled and fell, his hands reaching out desperately for something to hold on to. He felt the cold stone beneath him, the rough texture of the floor pressing against his skin. The whispers converged into a single, coherent sound, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very depths of the hospital. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Vincent's breath turned to mist in front of him. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, numbing his fingers and toes. The growl grew louder, more insistent, reverberating through the room like the roar of some ancient beast. Suddenly, the lights came back on, their harsh glare illuminating the room in stark, fluorescent light. Vincent blinked, disoriented, his eyes adjusting to the brightness. The room was as he had left it, cluttered with old medical equipment and files, the control panel still showing static on the screens. But the oppressive feeling had not abated. He picked himself up, brushing the dust and grime from his clothes. The whispers had stopped, but the sensation of being watched remained, an unshakable presence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The cameras were still functioning, their feeds shifting to different angles of the hospital. He knew he couldn't stay here. The sense of dread was too overwhelming. Vincent turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. The hospital seemed to close in on him, its walls pressing in tighter with every step. The whispering voices had returned, their tones soft and insidious, filling the space around him with an almost palpable malevolence. He moved quickly, his flashlight flickering erratically as he navigated the labyrinthine hallways. The feeling of being watched was constant now, an oppressive weight that pressed down on him, making every step feel like a struggle. The shadows seemed to twist and stretch, their movements just beyond the edge of his vision. The hallways grew colder as he progressed, the air becoming thick and heavy. Vincent's breath came in short, ragged bursts, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, the shadows reaching out with invisible hands, pulling him deeper into the hospital's grasp. As he rounded a corner, he stumbled upon another room, this one different from the others. It was a small, dimly lit space, its walls lined with old, faded photographs. The images were dark and distorted, showing scenes from the hospital's past. Patients in various states of distress, doctors performing grim procedures. The photographs seemed to watch him, their eyes following his every movement. Vincent approached the photographs, his eyes scanning the images. The faces of the patients were etched with fear and anguish, their eyes hollow and haunted. The doctors in the photos appeared stern and detached, their expressions cold and unfeeling. In the center of the room stood a single, large mirror, its surface cracked and stained. The reflection showed the room behind him, but as he moved closer, the mirror seemed to distort the image, the room appearing twisted and warped. The shadows around him deepened, and the whispers grew louder, converging into a single, coherent message that seemed to come from the mirror itself. Vincent stared at the mirror, his reflection fragmented and distorted. The whispers grew louder, the growl from before returning, filling the room with a deep, resonant sound. The temperature in the room dropped, and Vincent could see his breath fogging up the mirror's surface. He reached out to touch the mirror, but as his fingers brushed against the glass, the room seemed to shift. The walls began to pulse with a dark energy, the shadows stretching and writhing as if alive. The whispers became a cacophony, a torrent of voices that filled his mind with a sense of dread and despair. The mirror's surface rippled, and Vincent's reflection began to change. The distorted image of himself morphed into something else, something monstrous and inhuman. The eyes in the reflection were dark, hollow voids, and the figure's mouth was twisted into a silent scream. Vincent recoiled, stumbling back from the mirror. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing in tighter as the shadows grew darker and more oppressive. The whispers converged into a single, overpowering sensation, a feeling of being trapped, of being suffocated by the darkness. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, the glass shards scattering across the floor. Vincent fell to his knees, the darkness closing in around him, the shadows twisting and writhing as if they were alive. The growl from before was deafening now, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the hospital. Vincent's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he struggled to get up. He could feel the darkness pressing in on him, the oppressive weight of the shadows threatening to crush him. The whispers grew louder, filling the space around him with an almost palpable malevolence. He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling beneath him. The room was a whirlwind of darkness and shattered glass, the whispers and growls converging into a single, overpowering sensation. Vincent knew he had to escape, to find a way out of this nightmarish place before it consumed him completely. He stumbled out of the room, his flashlight flickering weakly as he navigated the twisting corridors. The hospital seemed to shift and change around him, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive with every step. The whispers and growls followed him, a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that lurked within the hospital's walls. The hallways stretched on endlessly, the darkness closing in tighter with every step. Vincent's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he stumbled through the labyrinthine corridors, the oppressive feeling of being watched growing stronger with each passing moment. He continued to run, the sense of dread growing more intense, until he reached a door at the end of a particularly long corridor. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling with exhaustion and fear. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. Inside, the room was filled with old, dusty furniture and stacks of papers. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Vincent stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a shuddering breath. The room was eerily silent, the oppressive darkness seeming to recede slightly. Vincent's flashlight flickered and then died, leaving him in a dim, muted gloom. He sank to the floor, his back against the door, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart. The hospital had become a nightmarish maze, each room and corridor twisting into another, the shadows seeming to come alive with malevolent intent. The sense of being watched never left him, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of his vision. Vincent opened his eyes, staring into the darkness. He could feel the weight of the shadows pressing down on him, the whispers and growls fading into an unsettling silence. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the oppressive feeling lifted. The whispers were gone, the growls fading into silence. The darkness seemed to recede slightly, the shadows retreating into the corners of the room. Vincent stood up, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He knew he couldn't stay here, that he had to keep moving. The hospital was a place of darkness and despair, a nightmarish labyrinth that seemed to change and shift with every step. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The hospital had become a prison, and he had to find a way out before it consumed him completely. With a final, resolute glance at the dimly lit room, he turned and stepped back into the corridor, ready to face whatever horrors awaited him in the labyrinthine depths of the hospital. Chapter 11. The Vanishing Ward. Vincent stumbled into the next corridor, his senses overwhelmed by the unending darkness and the relentless chill that seemed to seep into his very soul. The oppressive silence was punctuated only by the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional drip of water echoing through the empty hallways. He moved cautiously, his flashlight wavering as he tried to maintain a sense of direction. The dim light revealed walls lined with old, peeling paint and broken windows, their glass shattered long ago. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the feeling of being watched growing more intense with each step. As he walked, Vincent noticed a door slightly ajar at the end of the corridor. It was different from the others, neatly painted and well-maintained, as if it had been recently refurbished. Curiosity piqued, he approached the door, pushing it open to reveal a room bathed in eerie, dim light. The room was immaculate, a stark contrast to the rest of the hospital. The floor was polished, the walls freshly painted, and the furniture arranged with meticulous care. It was a stark reminder of the hospital's past, a glimpse into what it must have looked like before the decay set in. Vincent stepped inside, the floor creaking softly beneath his feet. The room was filled with medical equipment that looked almost new, though the dust on the surfaces suggested it had been in use for some time. There were examination tables, charts pinned to the walls, and various medical instruments neatly organized on shelves. He moved through the room, examining the equipment with a mix of fascination and dread. The sterile environment felt oddly out of place amidst the hospital's overall decay. Everything was in perfect order, as if waiting for someone to return and use it. The contrast between the room's pristine condition and the surrounding dilapidation was jarring. Vincent's attention was drawn to a large window on one wall. The glass was clean, offering a clear view of the storm raging outside. The rain battered the window, and the flashes of lightning illuminated the scene with a ghostly glow. As he watched, the view shifted, the scene outside warping and twisting as if seen through a distorted lens. Suddenly, the light in the room flickered, and the temperature dropped sharply. Vincent turned, his flashlight casting long, jittery shadows across the room. The pristine environment seemed to shift, the walls and floor warping subtly as if reacting to some unseen force. The lights flickered again, and Vincent's reflection in the window seemed to distort, his image warping and shifting like a mirage. He reached out to touch the window, but the glass felt cold and unnervingly smooth, as if it were made of ice. The room's atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with an oppressive weight. The whispers began again, faint and insidious, weaving through the room like a tangible presence. Vincent's heart raced as he tried to make sense of the sounds. The whispers were incomprehensible, their tones fluctuating between mournful and menacing. He turned his attention back to the window, his gaze fixed on the storm outside. The view had changed once more, the rain and lightning giving way to a dark, swirling mist that obscured the outside world. The mist seemed to writhe and pulse, its movements hypnotic and unnerving. Vincent's reflection in the window grew more distorted, the image of himself twisting and contorting. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single, incoherent murmur that filled the room with a sense of dread. He could feel the temperature dropping further, the cold becoming almost unbearable. The door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound echoing through the corridor. Vincent jumped, his flashlight flickering wildly as he turned to face the door. The once immaculate room was now shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the flickering window. Panic surged through him as he tried to open the door, but it was firmly shut, the handle refusing to turn. He pounded on the door, his fists striking the solid wood with growing desperation. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of anguished voices, their tones rising and falling in a haunting rhythm. As Vincent struggled with the door, the room seemed to shift around him. The walls and floor warped and twisted, the pristine environment melting away to reveal a more sinister reality. The medical equipment began to flicker and distort, the once neat arrangements becoming chaotic and disorganized. The whispers grew louder, converging into a single, overwhelming sound. The growl from before returned, a deep, resonant rumble that filled the room with a sense of impending doom. Vincent could feel the darkness closing in, the oppressive weight of the shadows pressing down on him. He collapsed to the floor, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The room was a whirlwind of shifting shadows and distorted images, the whispers and growls converging into a single, overpowering presence. The temperature dropped even further, the cold seeping into his bones. Vincent's flashlight died, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers and growls faded into an unsettling silence, leaving him in a void of darkness and despair. He could feel the weight of the shadows pressing down on him, the sensation of being trapped growing more intense with each passing moment. In the pitch-black room, Vincent's senses were overwhelmed by the darkness. The shadows seemed to come alive, their movements almost tangible. He could feel them wrapping around him, their presence suffocating and inescapable. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in harsh, fluorescent light. Vincent blinked, disoriented, his eyes adjusting to the brightness. The room was as it had been before, the pristine environment restored, the whispers and growls gone. He struggled to his feet, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The door was still firmly shut, the handle refusing to turn. He knew he couldn't stay here. The oppressive feeling of being watched was too overwhelming. Vincent took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The hospital had become a nightmarish maze, each room and corridor twisting into another, the shadows seeming to come alive with malevolent intent. The sense of dread and despair was constant, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of his vision. He turned away from the door, his flashlight flickering weakly as he navigated the shifting hallways. The whispers had returned, their tones soft and insidious, filling the space around him with an almost palpable malevolence. The hospital seemed to close in on him, the shadows stretching and writhing as if they were alive. Vincent continued to move through the corridors, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he had experienced. The room had seemed like a haven, a brief respite from the hospital's decay, but it had quickly turned into another trap, a manifestation of the darkness that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. He stumbled through the labyrinthine hallways, the shadows pressing in on him with increasing intensity. The whispers grew louder, converging into a single, coherent message that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The darkness was closing in, the oppressive weight of the shadows growing more palpable with every step. Vincent reached another door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. Inside, the room was filled with old, dusty furniture and stacks of papers. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a shuddering breath. The room was eerily silent, the oppressive darkness seeming to recede slightly. Vincent's flashlight flickered and then died, leaving him in a dim, muted gloom. He sank to the floor, his back against the door, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The hospital had become a nightmarish maze, each room and corridor twisting into another, the shadows seeming to come alive with malevolent intent. The sense of dread and despair was constant, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of his vision. Vincent closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart. The hospital had become a prison, and he had to find a way out before it consumed him completely. With a final, resolute glance at the dimly lit room, he prepared to face whatever horrors awaited him in the labyrinthine depths of the hospital. Chapter 12. Echoes of the Past. Vincent's footsteps echoed through the dimly lit corridor, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. The hallway stretched out before him, a seemingly endless expanse of darkness punctuated by the occasional flicker of a failing light bulb. The oppressive weight of the shadows seemed to press in from all sides, an ever-present reminder of the malevolent force that lurked within the hospital's walls. He moved with deliberate caution, each step measured and careful. The sense of being watched was almost tangible, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. Every so often, a soft whisper of sound, a distant, indistinguishable murmur, seemed to drift through the air, adding to the atmosphere of foreboding. As he walked, Vincent's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that danced across the walls. The darkness seemed to pulse and writhe with each flicker, creating an illusion of movement that made the hallway feel alive. The shadows seemed to reach out, curling and twisting in an almost hypnotic dance. The corridor eventually opened up into a large, cavernous room. The space was filled with old, dusty furniture and medical equipment covered in thick layers of grime. The walls were lined with faded photographs and documents, their surfaces yellowed with age. The room was eerily silent, the oppressive darkness broken only by the dim, flickering light from Vincent's flashlight. He stepped into the room, his footsteps stirring up motes of dust that danced in the dim light. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay, and the temperature seemed to drop as he moved deeper into the space. The room felt like a mausoleum, a forgotten relic from a bygone era. Vincent's attention was drawn to a large, antique desk in the center of the room. The desk was cluttered with old papers, medical charts, and faded photographs. He approached the desk cautiously, his flashlight revealing a jumble of documents and artifacts. The photographs depicted scenes from the hospital's past, patients in period clothing, doctors and nurses in their uniforms, and various hospital facilities. The images were haunting in their stillness, each one a snapshot of a time long gone. Vincent's gaze lingered on the photographs, a sense of melancholy washing over him as he imagined the lives that had once been intertwined within these walls. He picked up a faded document, its edges crumbling with age. The text was barely legible, the ink smudged and faded. As he studied the document, he could make out fragments of information, names, dates, and cryptic notes that hinted at a dark history. The room's atmosphere grew heavier, the oppressive darkness seeming to close in around him. The whispers returned, their tones low and mournful. The sound was almost rhythmic, like the distant murmur of a forgotten lullaby. Vincent's heart raced as he struggled to make sense of the sounds, his breath coming in short, anxious bursts. He continued to explore the room, his flashlight illuminating the various artifacts and documents scattered throughout. The medical equipment was old and worn, its once shiny surfaces now covered in layers of dust. The instruments were arranged haphazardly, as if abandoned in a hurry. As he moved to another corner of the room, Vincent's flashlight revealed a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror's surface was covered in a thick layer of grime, and its frame was intricately carved with disturbing patterns. The reflection in the mirror was distorted, the glass warped and cracked. Vincent approached the mirror cautiously, his flashlight casting eerie shadows across the surface. The reflection seemed to shift and change, the distorted images of the room blending with shadowy figures that seemed to move just out of sight. The mirror was unsettling, its presence adding to the growing sense of unease. The whispers grew louder, their tones rising and falling in a haunting rhythm. Vincent could feel the oppressive weight of the shadows pressing down on him, the sense of being watched growing more intense. The mirror seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. He turned away from the mirror, his flashlight flickering as he moved. The room seemed to close in around him, the darkness growing thicker with each step. The whispers and growls converged into a single, overwhelming presence, the sense of dread becoming almost unbearable. Vincent's flashlight died, plunging the room into darkness. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint echoes of the whispers, their tones merging into a single, haunting melody. The air was cold and heavy, the darkness pressing in on him with a suffocating intensity. He stumbled through the room, his senses overwhelmed by the oppressive atmosphere. The shadows seemed to reach out, their movements almost tangible. He could feel them wrapping around him, their presence suffocating and inescapable. Vincent reached for the door, his hand trembling as he fumbled with the handle. The door creaked open, revealing another dimly lit corridor beyond. He stepped out into the hallway, the oppressive darkness closing in around him. The corridor was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint echo of his footsteps. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and writhing with each step. Vincent moved with a sense of urgency, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he navigated the twisting passages. The whispers grew louder, their tones converging into a single, coherent message that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The darkness was closing in, the oppressive weight of the shadows growing more palpable with every step. Vincent's flashlight flickered and dimmed, its beam growing weaker as he moved. The sense of being watched was constant, an unshakable presence that followed him wherever he went. The hospital had become a nightmarish labyrinth, its shadows stretching and writhing as if they were alive. He reached another door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. Inside, the room was filled with old, dusty furniture and stacks of papers. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a shuddering breath. The room was eerily silent, the oppressive darkness seeming to recede slightly. Vincent's flashlight flickered and then died, leaving him in a dim, muted gloom. He sank to the floor, his back against the door, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The hospital had become a nightmarish maze, each room and corridor twisting into another, the shadows seeming to come alive with malevolent intent. The sense of dread and despair was constant, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of his vision. Vincent closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart. The hospital had become a prison, and he had to find a way out before it consumed him completely. With a final, resolute glance at the dimly lit room, he prepared to face whatever horrors awaited him in the labyrinthine depths of the hospital. Chapter 13. The Echoing Hall. Vincent's path through the hospital had led him to a long, winding corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, and every step he took was accompanied by a deep, resonant echo that made the silence feel even more oppressive. The corridor was lined with old, rusted doors, their surfaces marred by time and neglect. Some doors were ajar, revealing dark, shadowy interiors that seemed to beckon him with a silent, malevolent allure. The walls were adorned with faded, peeling wallpaper, their once vibrant colors now reduced to a ghostly, muted hue. Vincent moved cautiously, his flashlight casting narrow beams of light that flickered and danced across the walls. The darkness seemed to ripple and shift with each flicker, creating the illusion of movement in the stillness. The sense of being watched was almost palpable, the oppressive atmosphere weighing heavily on him. He noticed a series of old, decrepit mirrors mounted on the walls at irregular intervals. The mirrors were cracked and stained, their surfaces reflecting distorted images of the corridor. Each reflection seemed to shift and warp, the shadows within the mirrors taking on a life of their own. Vincent's own reflection appeared fragmented and surreal, adding to the eerie ambience of the corridor. As he walked, Vincent could hear a faint, rhythmic thudding sound, like the distant beating of a drum. The sound was intermittent, its source elusive and difficult to pinpoint. It seemed to resonate through the corridor, amplifying the feeling of dread that had settled over him. The temperature dropped noticeably, the air growing colder with each step. Vincent's breath became visible, each exhale forming a misty cloud that dissipated quickly. The oppressive cold seemed to seep into his bones, intensifying the sense of discomfort and unease. He approached one of the doors, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. The door was slightly ajar, and as Vincent pushed it open, he was met with a dark, musty room that seemed to have been abandoned for years. The room was cluttered with old, rotting furniture and broken medical equipment, the air thick with the smell of decay. Vincent stepped inside, his flashlight revealing a jumble of objects strewn haphazardly across the floor. The walls were lined with old, yellowed papers and faded photographs, their surfaces stained and worn. The room felt heavy with a sense of lingering sadness, the remnants of a time long gone. He moved through the room, his flashlight casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The photographs depicted scenes from the hospital's past, patients in various states of distress, doctors and nurses engaged in somber tasks, and glimpses of the hospital's earlier, more prosperous days. The images were haunting in their stillness, each one a silent testament to the lives that had once been intertwined within these walls. Vincent's attention was drawn to a large, dusty cabinet in one corner of the room. The cabinet was filled with old medical instruments and jars of preserved specimens. The instruments were covered in layers of grime, their once shiny surfaces now tarnished and corroded. The jars contained various fluids and tissues, their contents preserved in a state of macabre stasis. As Vincent examined the cabinet, he noticed a small, faded journal tucked away in one of the drawers. He pulled it out carefully, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The journal was filled with handwritten notes and sketches, the ink smudged and faded. The entries were cryptic and fragmented, offering glimpses into the thoughts and experiences of a long-gone occupant of the hospital. The rhythmic thudding sound grew louder, its source now more apparent. It seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the hospital, its rhythmic pulse resonating through the walls and floors. The sound was unsettling, its presence a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked within the hospital's depths. Vincent continued to explore the room, his flashlight revealing more hidden corners and forgotten objects. The sense of being watched was intense, the shadows in the room seeming to move and shift with a life of their own. The oppressive atmosphere grew thicker, the cold and darkness closing in around him. As he moved toward another door at the far end of the room, he felt a sudden, sharp chill that made him shiver uncontrollably. The temperature had dropped even further, the cold becoming almost unbearable. Vincent's breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air stinging his lungs. He reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling with cold and fear. The door creaked open slowly, revealing another dark corridor beyond. The rhythmic thudding sound was now accompanied by a soft, mournful whisper that seemed to drift through the air, adding to the eerie ambience. Vincent stepped out into the corridor, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. The whispers grew louder, their tones rising and falling in a haunting melody. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, their movements almost hypnotic. The corridor was a nightmarish maze, its walls and floor warped and distorted. He continued through the corridor, his flashlight flickering and dimming as he moved. The sense of being watched was constant, an unshakable presence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The rhythmic thudding sound grew louder, its source now almost deafening. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, each turn and corner leading to more darkness and shadows. The oppressive atmosphere grew thicker, the cold and darkness closing in around him. Vincent's flashlight finally died, leaving him in a pitch-black void. The whispers and thudding sounds continued, their presence overwhelming and inescapable. The darkness pressed in on him, the sense of being trapped and suffocated growing more intense with each passing moment. Vincent could feel the weight of the shadows wrapping around him, their presence suffocating and all-consuming. He stumbled through the corridor, his senses overwhelmed by the darkness. The shadows seemed to come alive, their movements almost tangible. He could feel them closing in on him, their presence pressing down with an almost physical force. The corridor seemed to twist and distort, the walls and floor warping and shifting as if reacting to some unseen force. The rhythmic thudding sound grew louder, its pulse resonating through the corridor with an almost unbearable intensity. The whispers converged into a single, haunting melody that filled the space with an eerie, mournful resonance. Vincent reached another door, his hand trembling as he fumbled with the handle. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. Inside, the room was filled with old, rotting furniture and stacks of papers. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a shuddering breath. The room was eerily silent, the oppressive darkness seeming to recede slightly. Vincent sank to the floor, his back against the door, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The hospital had become a nightmarish labyrinth, each room and corridor twisting into another, the shadows seeming to come alive with malevolent intent. With a final, resolute glance at the dimly lit room, Vincent prepared to face whatever horrors awaited him in the labyrinthine depths of the hospital. Chapter 14. The Forsaken Ward. The hallway that Vincent emerged into was distinct from the others he had traversed. Its decay was more pronounced, and the oppressive silence seemed almost tangible. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper that revealed the bare, crumbling plaster beneath. A cold draft drifted through the corridor, carrying with it the faint, unpleasant odor of mildew and decay. Vincent's flashlight flickered weakly as he continued forward, casting a feeble beam of light that seemed to barely penetrate the surrounding darkness. The corridor was lined with doors on either side, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. Some doors were slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of shadowed rooms beyond. He approached one of the open doors and peered inside. The room was a barren, desolate space, filled with rotting furniture and broken medical equipment. A large window on one side of the room was partially shattered, its broken glass scattered across the floor. The room felt cold and unwelcoming, its air thick with a sense of abandonment. Vincent moved cautiously through the corridor, his flashlight revealing intermittent patches of rusted metal and stained linoleum. The sense of isolation was palpable, the oppressive quiet broken only by the distant creaking of the building as it settled. Each step he took was accompanied by a dull, echoing thud, the sound amplified by the vast emptiness of the ward. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the oppressive darkness closing in around him. The air grew colder with each step, the draft becoming more pronounced. Vincent's breath came out in visible puffs, each exhale dissipating quickly into the frigid air. He reached another door, its surface covered in a thick layer of grime. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a large, dimly lit room. The room was filled with old, rusted hospital beds and broken medical apparatus. The beds were covered in dusty, tattered sheets, their metal frames corroded and rusted. Vincent stepped into the room, his flashlight casting eerie shadows across the walls and furniture. The room was filled with discarded items, empty medicine bottles, broken vials, and faded medical charts. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the remnants of a bygone era lingering in the stagnant atmosphere. He moved through the room, his flashlight illuminating the various artifacts and remnants of the past. The walls were lined with faded photographs and documents, their surfaces yellowed and worn. The photographs depicted scenes from the hospital's earlier days, patients in various states of distress, doctors and nurses in their uniforms, and glimpses of the hospital's former grandeur. Vincent's attention was drawn to a large, ornate mirror mounted on one wall. The mirror's surface was covered in a thick layer of dust, its frame intricately carved with unsettling patterns. The reflection in the mirror was distorted, the glass warped and cracked. The mirror seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its presence adding to the eerie ambience of the room. He approached the mirror cautiously, his flashlight casting erratic beams of light that danced across the surface. The reflections seemed to shift and change, the distorted images of the room blending with shadowy figures that moved just out of sight. The mirror was unsettling, its presence a reminder of the malevolent force that seemed to permeate the hospital. Vincent continued to explore the room, his flashlight revealing more hidden corners and forgotten objects. The sense of being watched was intense, the shadows in the room seeming to move and shift with a life of their own. The oppressive atmosphere grew thicker, the cold and darkness closing in around him. As he moved toward another corner of the room, Vincent noticed a series of old, faded medical charts pinned to the wall. The charts were filled with handwritten notes and diagrams, the ink smudged and faded. The notes were cryptic and fragmented, offering glimpses into the medical practices and procedures of a time long past. The rhythmic thudding sound that Vincent had heard earlier grew louder, its source now more apparent. The sound seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the hospital, its rhythmic pulse resonating through the walls and floors. The sound was unsettling, its presence a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked within the hospital's depths. Vincent's flashlight flickered and dimmed, its beam growing weaker as he moved. The sense of being watched was constant, an unshakable presence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The hospital had become a nightmarish labyrinth, its shadows stretching and writhing as if they were alive. He reached another door, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. The door was slightly ajar, and as Vincent pushed it open, he was met with a long, narrow corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The corridor was lined with more doors, each one slightly ajar and revealing dark, shadowy interiors. Vincent stepped into the corridor, the oppressive darkness closing in around him. The whispers returned, their tones low and mournful. The sound was almost rhythmic, like the distant murmur of a forgotten lullaby. Vincent's heart raced as he struggled to make sense of the sounds, his breath coming in short, anxious bursts. He continued down the corridor, his flashlight casting narrow beams of light that flickered and danced across the walls. The shadows seemed to pulse and writhe with each flicker, creating an illusion of movement that made the corridor feel alive. The oppressive atmosphere grew thicker, the cold and darkness closing in around him. The corridor eventually opened up into a large, dimly lit room. The room was filled with old, dusty furniture and medical equipment covered in thick layers of grime. The walls were lined with faded photographs and documents, their surfaces yellowed with age. The room felt like a mausoleum, a forgotten relic from a bygone era. Vincent's attention was drawn to a large, dusty cabinet in one corner of the room. The cabinet was filled with old medical instruments and jars of preserved specimens. The instruments were covered in layers of grime, their once shiny surfaces now tarnished and corroded. The jars contained various fluids and tissues, their contents preserved in a state of macabre stasis. As Vincent examined the cabinet, he noticed a small, faded journal tucked away in one of the drawers. He pulled it out carefully, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The journal was filled with handwritten notes and sketches, the ink smudged and faded. The entries were cryptic and fragmented, offering glimpses into the thoughts and experiences of a long-gone occupant of the hospital. The rhythmic thudding sound grew louder, its source now almost deafening. It seemed to resonate through the room, its pulse reverberating through the walls and floor. The whispers grew louder, their tones converging into a single, haunting melody that filled the space with an eerie, mournful resonance. Vincent could feel the oppressive weight of the shadows pressing down on him, the sense of being trapped and suffocated growing more intense with each passing moment. The darkness seemed to come alive, the shadows reaching out with an almost tangible presence. With a final, resolute glance at the dimly lit room, Vincent prepared to face whatever horrors awaited him in the labyrinthine depths of the hospital. The sense of dread and despair was constant, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of his vision. Chapter 15. The Final Confrontation. Vincent's journey through the forsaken hospital had led him to the heart of the building, where the oppressive darkness seemed to coalesce into a singular, overwhelming force. The corridors had become a twisted maze, each turn and corner revealing new horrors and hidden depths. The rhythmic thudding sound and haunting whispers had grown ever more intense, guiding him toward the final, foreboding chamber. As Vincent approached a large, heavy door at the end of a dimly lit hallway, a palpable sense of dread hung in the air. The door was ornate and imposing, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift as if alive. The metal was tarnished and corroded, its surface pitted and scarred from years of neglect. He hesitated for a moment, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The rhythmic thudding sound resonated louder and more insistent, its source seemingly emanating from beyond the door. The whispers had intensified, merging into a cacophony of mournful and dissonant tones that filled the air with an unsettling resonance. Vincent pushed open the door with a creaking groan, revealing a vast, cavernous room bathed in an eerie, dim light. The room was immense, its walls and ceiling lost in the shadows of the darkness. The light came from a single, flickering chandelier that hung from the center of the room, its candles long burned down to stubs. The room was filled with old, dusty furniture and medical equipment, their surfaces covered in thick layers of grime and cobwebs. The furniture was arranged in a disorganized manner, as if hastily abandoned. Scattered papers and broken glass littered the floor, their presence adding to the sense of desolation. At the far end of the room, Vincent saw an imposing altar, its surface adorned with strange, arcane symbols and inscriptions. The altar was made of dark stone, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Above the altar, a large, faded tapestry hung from the wall, its intricate patterns barely visible through the layers of grime. Vincent approached the altar cautiously, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The rhythmic thudding sound was now almost deafening, its pulse resonating through the walls and floor. The whispers had converged into a single, mournful melody that seemed to fill the room with an otherworldly presence. As he examined the altar, Vincent noticed several strange objects arranged on its surface. There were old, rusted surgical instruments, cracked vials, and faded medical charts, all arranged in a seemingly ritualistic manner. The objects were covered in a thick layer of dust, their once shiny surfaces now tarnished and corroded. He moved closer to the tapestry, its surface covered in layers of grime. The tapestry depicted a nightmarish scene, a chaotic swirl of dark, abstract patterns that seemed to shift and writhe as Vincent's flashlight flickered. The image was unsettling, its presence adding to the oppressive atmosphere of the room. Vincent's attention was drawn to a large, ornate book resting on the altar. The book was bound in dark leather, its surface embossed with strange, arcane symbols. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with cryptic text and unsettling illustrations. The book seemed to emanate a dark energy, its presence a reminder of the malevolent force that pervaded the hospital. As Vincent reached for the book, he felt a sudden, intense cold that made him shiver uncontrollably. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, the cold air stinging his skin and making it difficult to breathe. The rhythmic thudding sound and the mournful whispers grew louder, their presence almost overwhelming. He opened the book carefully, the brittle pages crackling as he turned them. The illustrations were haunting and surreal, depicting nightmarish scenes of torment and suffering. The text was written in a strange, archaic script, its meaning obscured by time and decay. The more Vincent read, the more he felt a growing sense of unease, the oppressive atmosphere of the room closing in around him. The rhythmic thudding sound suddenly ceased, replaced by a deep, resonant silence that filled the room. The whispers grew faint, their mournful tones fading into the background. The oppressive darkness seemed to retreat slightly, the room bathed in a dim, unsettling light. Vincent felt a sudden, overwhelming presence, a malevolent force that seemed to permeate the room. The darkness seemed to come alive, its shadows writhing and twisting with an almost tangible intensity. The air grew heavy with a sense of dread, the weight of the shadows pressing down on him with an almost physical force. He turned to face the room, his flashlight flickering and dimming as he moved. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, their movements almost hypnotic. The oppressive darkness closed in around him, the sense of being trapped and suffocated growing more intense with each passing moment. Vincent's breaths came in short, ragged gasps as he struggled to maintain his composure. The rhythmic thudding sound returned, its pulse resonating through the room with an almost unbearable intensity. The whispers grew louder, their mournful tones converging into a single, haunting melody that filled the space with an eerie resonance. He felt an overwhelming sense of despair, the oppressive atmosphere closing in around him. The darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides, the sense of being watched and trapped growing more intense. The shadows seemed to reach out with an almost tangible presence, their movements almost palpable. Vincent's flashlight finally died, plunging the room into complete darkness. The rhythmic thudding sound and the mournful whispers continued, their presence almost deafening. The oppressive darkness pressed in on him, the sense of being trapped and suffocated growing more intense. In the pitch-black void, Vincent felt a sudden, intense warmth that contrasted sharply with the surrounding cold. The warmth seemed to emanate from the altar, its presence almost comforting. He reached out instinctively, his hand brushing against the dark stone surface of the altar. The warmth grew more intense, the oppressive darkness receding slightly. The rhythmic thudding sound and the mournful whispers faded into the background, their presence becoming less overwhelming. The room was filled with a sense of calm and serenity, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. Vincent's senses slowly returned to him as the warmth enveloped him. The darkness seemed to retreat, the oppressive shadows receding into the corners of the room. The rhythmic thudding sound and the mournful whispers had faded into a faint, distant echo, their presence no longer overwhelming. As the warmth enveloped him, Vincent felt a sense of peace and resolution. The oppressive darkness that had pervaded the hospital seemed to recede, the sense of dread and despair lifting slightly. The room was still and quiet, the oppressive atmosphere replaced by a calm and serene stillness. Vincent took a deep breath, the cold air now less oppressive. He looked around the room, the dim light revealing the remnants of the hospital's past. The shadows were less menacing, their presence now a faint, distant echo. With a final, resolute glance at the room, Vincent prepared to leave the hospital behind. The oppressive darkness and malevolent forces that had plagued him seemed to have receded, leaving behind a sense of calm and resolution. The hospital, once a nightmarish labyrinth of shadows and dread, was now a place of eerie stillness and quiet. As Vincent made his way toward the exit, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, the darkness and whispers fading into the background. The hospital's dark legacy had been confronted, its malevolent forces subdued, leaving behind a sense of peace and resolution.